days.
You're watching Beyond 100 Days. In a striking rebuke, Mr. Trump calls his own intelligence chiefs naive and passive and says they need to go back to school.
The Twitter tirade is aimed squarely at the heads of the CIA, the FBI and the Director of National Intelligence, all people Mr. Trump himself appointed.
Yesterday, those same chiefs went to Congress and contradicted the president on the top security issues facing the United States. Many say the last 2 years has been a wild ride in American politics. We take to the ice to see what voters think of President Trump at the halfway mark of his first term.
While some have found it an exhilarating time, it's not been without its carnage and its casualties. And of course, I'm not talking about this race.
Also on the programme, the Europeans speak with one voice. They will not be replacing the Northern Ireland backstop, not for any alternative arrangements. Parts of the US are in the deep freeze. It's so cold in the Midwest. This is what happens when you throw boiling water in the air.
Hello, I'm Catty Kane, Washington. Christian Fraser is in London. Donald Trump is in open conflict with his intelligence chiefs after they publicly countered his positions on a range of national security issues. He called them naive and suggested they don't know what they're talking about.
Yesterday, at an annual Senate hearing on the security threats facing America, the head of the CIA, the head of the FBI and the Director of National Intelligence contradicted Mr. Trump on the top security issues facing the United States, Iran, North Korea, and noticeably on so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, as they call it.
We have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly.
ISIS will continue to be a threat to the United States.
They still command thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria.
Well, today, predictably, Mr. Trump hit back on Twitter. The intelligence people seem to be extremely passive and naive, he wrote, when it comes to the dangers of Iran. Perhaps intelligence should go back to school.
OK, so let's talk to our North America editor, John Sopel. It wasn't just on ISIS, also on North Korea. Mr. Trump has said that there is denuclearization, that it's positive. They've said no, not so fast. Same kind of situation on Iran. Why are we seeing this discrepancy, John, between what the intelligence chiefs are talking about in Congress and what Mr. Trump says?
Because Donald Trump doesn't trust his intelligence chiefs. Never has done. Now, fine, 2 years ago when you were able to say these were the leftovers of the Obama administration, these were representatives of the deep state. But as you pointed out in your headlines, these are his appointments. These are the people, the Republicans that he trusts to run the CIA, the FBI and the National Intelligence Department. And he kind of, you know, they didn't mention his policies, but one by one, they demolished his position on North Korea. They questioned his position on Iran, and they questioned his position on ISIS. And I think for all of those reasons, those intelligence chiefs, and I don't wish to blur the stories in your running order, are out in a polar vortex for the rest of the day.
Yeah, one thing that they did not talk about as a national security threat to the United States, John, was the border with Mexico.
And that, in some ways, for me, that was the most significant, because we know there have been differences. Donald Trump has always taken a much more benign view, say, on what Russia is up to than his intelligence chiefs. But the House is midway through, the Congress is midway through debating whether it's going to keep the government open in 3 weeks' time. And if not, there's a widespread expectation that Donald Trump will move to push an emergency, declare a national emergency on the southern border for national security grounds, because it's so bad there. How weird, then, that the three national intelligence leaders of the United States of America didn't even mention it. Now, why that's significant, there'll be a legal challenge if he goes ahead and introduces a national emergency. And the first argument that any defence is going to say is, but why is there's no national emergency? Your national intelligence chiefs didn't even mention it.
Let me put the counterpoint, John. There are many Trump supporters who are growing weary of these endless overseas campaigns that many of these intelligence chiefs, perhaps in their military days, were involved with. They like the fact that he's bringing home the troops, and there is, within the polls, you see it, among Republicans, they're starting to shift attitudes even towards Russia.
Of course, and you know, it is a natural instinct that you want your troops out of harm's way, if at all possible. But it's the claims and the counterclaims. So Donald Trump says that ISIS is defeated, and they're giving a much more nuanced reply, saying they may not hold the same landmass as they once did, but they are still a potent fighting force and therefore should be taken seriously. Donald Trump says that Iran is trying to kind of develop nuclear weapons and is in breach of the Iran agreement. You heard the director of the FBI and the CIA saying, no, not the case. And so it's not just a question of what should the policy be about keeping troops overseas. It's the fact that Donald Trump just disagrees with the professional advice that he's being given.
Jon Sopel, thank you very much.
And that's precisely the point, isn't it, Cathy? Just reading some of the comment pieces today after that hearing, you get the feeling that these top intelligence chiefs, they want him to consult. There is expertise at hand. They have some of the best intelligence available. What they don't want is the knee-jerk reactions. They want him to consult.
You know, there's a pattern here for Donald Trump, and people who've written biographies of him and who have followed him for decades, whether it's in his business life, his dealings with Trump University, other business ventures that he has been involved in, they say that there is a pattern where there is a reality and then there is Mr. Trump's reality, and he is quite capable of bending facts to support his version of reality. Now, when it comes to these intelligence issues, Mr. Trump has a very clear worldview, and I think there was a concern right from the beginning of his presidency. Would he then bend intelligence that was presented to him to fit that worldview, or would he take the intelligence and then form a worldview? I think what we've seen over the course of the last 24 hours, and it's something I have not seen in public, this kind of public rift between intelligence chiefs on policy and the executive in the White House, is that we've seen that actually what's happened is that he has a worldview and he is dismissing the intelligence and the intelligence chiefs when they're presenting him with those facts. It will not go down well in the CIA or the FBI. In a building next to the White House, meanwhile, officials from two global superpowers are huddling to see if they can stave off a trade war that will affect countries and companies right around the world. The Chinese and American negotiators have given themselves 48 hours.
And if they fail, then on March the 2nd, America will impose tariffs of 25% on a further $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. And the early signs are not altogether positive. There's a giant elephant in the room, which they're all trying to ignore. Yes, Huawei. On Tuesday, the US Justice Department filed a host of criminal charges against the Chinese telecoms giant and its chief financial officer for, among other things, theft of intellectual property and breaking sanctions on Iran. So, where do we stand so far with the current trade war? Well, this is what the two countries import from the other, $506 and $130 billion respectively. So far, both the US and China have $34 billion worth of tariffs in effect. They've another $16 billion ready to go.
Yeah, but that's a drop in the ocean compared to the $260 billion respectively that could be on the way if these talks fail. And the cost of a full-scale trade war, the Bank of England estimates that growth of the UK economy would be held back by 2% and America's by 5%. Our business correspondent Michelle Fleury is in Washington, where the talks are taking place. How much pressure is there on American negotiators to get a deal, given that American companies, Michelle, are starting to say to the White House, look, this is really hurting us?
Well, I mean, anecdotally, we're hearing from companies like Apple saying that in Greater China, their revenues are down $5 billion. You've got Harley-Davidson talking about the impact that trade wars are having on its business. You've got Caterpillar also this week talking about the slowdown in China and how that's having a knock-on effect on their results. So the anecdotal evidence is pointing to the fact that despite what administration officials are saying, it does seem to be having an impact on American companies. The question is, where does that leave them? You've got, on the one hand, concerns that are being driven over national security in the case of Huawei. That's partly behind this. You've also got a vision, a split vision over what the direction of these two giant economies should be. On the one hand, you've got the capitalist model, capitalist-led model here in America. You've got the state-led model in China. That's what the Americans would like to see changed. It's a big ask, and it's unclear whether the Chinese can meet them on that.
And Michelle, President Trump probably thinks he has the upper hand at the moment, given the lagging Chinese economy. But we've seen around the world, when we looked at those growth figures that were down last week in China, everybody's slightly panicking because it affects the world economy when China slows down.
Yeah, I mean, we had Christine Lagarde in Davos recently, the head of the IMF, warning that trade wars would have a negative effect on a slowing global economy. There is increasing pressure on Donald Trump, especially after the shutdown. He could probably do with a political win. He's indicated in the past that he is certainly keen to have some sort of progress that he can show on this deal between the US and China. But the question is, that's a huge unknown. The Chinese have seen him fold when it came to the government shutdown. They may try to exploit what they see as a weakness. It's very difficult. Both sides could do with a compromise. But again, it goes back to this idea that the Americans feel the Chinese economy is unfair. And the question now is, how much are the Chinese willing to give on this? Will it be enough to satisfy some of the hawks that are in the American administration?
Okay, Michelle Fleury there for us. Michelle, thank you very much. And of course, on Huawei, so far the Chinese saying that they will keep Huawei separate from those trade talks. But given that Huawei's chief financial officer has just been indicted by the Americans, I wonder how that is going to go over the next 2 days. Last night, the UK Parliament voted to send the Prime Minister back to Brussels to secure alternative arrangements to the so-called backstop. That's the mechanism to prevent the return of a hard border in Ireland. The arrangement is unpopular among the Brexiteers, as it could keep the UK in a permanent customs union with the EU indefinitely, if no way can be found to keep the border free of infrastructure.
Today we got the EU response in full, and they have stolen Theresa May's favourite line. Nothing has changed. Jean-Claude Juncker, European Commission President, again insisted that the deal on the table remains the only option, and the withdrawal agreement signed by the Prime Minister in November will not be reopened.
The withdrawal agreement remains the best and only deal possible. The European Union said so in November. We said so in December. We said so after the first meaningful vote in the Commons in January. The debate and votes in the House of Commons yesterday do not change that.
With me, also in from the cold, is our UK political correspondent Rob Watson. Jean-Claude Juncker said today so-called alternative arrangements were discussed during the negotiation. The concept is not a plan, it's not an operational solution. And that's really the issue, Rob. Alternative arrangements aren't particularly specific.
No, they're not. I should say, by the way, greetings, Katie, and greetings, Christian, that I do have renewed admiration for what you do, having had a go at doing this last Thursday. It is not a question of just putting on a bit of makeup, looking in the camera, and she did actually, and trying not to say something utterly stupid. Right, moving swiftly on. It's not going well so far. I mean, if you think about what Theresa May did on Tuesday, it was a sort of screeching U-turn, suddenly saying she was prepared to revisit the withdrawal treaty, something that she said was not possible, to look specifically at how you avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland. And yet right away, the European Union is saying, hang on a minute, we're not reopening this treaty. And of course, the question has been asked, what on earth do you mean by an alternative to a hard border in Northern Ireland, to the idea of staying in a customs union? And the answer, really, specifics have come none.
But Michel Barnier did say, and I'm reading this because I took copious notes today so that I could follow what they were talking about. He said, we'll be more ambitious about the future partnership. If the UK were to evolve beyond a simple free trade agreement, we are flexible. What does that mean?
Well, I think that what the tone means is we're not opening this withdrawal treaty. We're trying to be nice to you. You look like you're absolute kind of chaos over there in the UK in terms of your politics. But it seems to me what he's trying to say is, look, we want to be nice. We want to have this great relationship. And maybe if your red line about not being in a customs union was to go a little sort of pinkish, whitish, or you know what I mean, some other sort of shade, then maybe this Northern Ireland problem wouldn't be so difficult. But of course, Theresa May gets back to square one, and that is the divisions within her governing Conservative Party. Why did she offer to open the renegotiated withdrawal treaty? It was basically to appease the right of her party that doesn't like the idea of a customs union, because they think that there are free trade deals to be struck outside the EU.
Okay, Rob, I'm going to disprove the theory that this is a complicated job, and I'm going to ask you the same question I think that I've asked you about 4 or 5 times on this subject. After the events of the last 24 hours, are we closer to a no deal, or are we closer to a second referendum?
Goodness gracious, that is an absolute cracking question. I would say marginally closer to a no deal, but I think what I'm going to say is neither.
Why? Why? If they're all ruling it out and they voted last night on an amendment which rules it out,
Well,
why do they all think that it could still happen?
Well, they have to say that, don't they? And after all, it is the default position. I mean, if nobody does anything between now and March 29th, Britain will leave the European Union without a deal. Duh, that's what happens. That's the law, as they say. Mm. But if I had to choose, I think I would say the most likely is delay. And why I say that is that even if Parliament eventually gets behind Theresa May's deal, despite how unloved it is, and you shouldn't rule that out, I mean, the idea that they would be able to do all the kind of changes to the law needed to get that done by March 29th seems a bit far-fetched to me. And if they were going to do some of the other things that have been suggested, softer Brexit, second referendum, general election, I mean, none of that's going to happen by March the 29th.
Do you know one of the redeeming features about the chaos that surrounds Brexit? It is the fact that people are going to extraordinary lengths to come up with metaphors, analogies, similes to describe what is going on. I particularly like this one from Mike, who phoned in to BBC Radio today, and he said this: a group go for a curry, the one who organises it gets a voucher that will save them lots of money. But they can only buy one sort of food. Some want korma, some jalfrezi, some veggie. And after much argument, they order vindaloo to annoy each other. Isn't that spot on?
Yeah.
Boom, boom.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, Robert,
thank you very much, sir. We will see you later. On both sides of the Atlantic, politics then is being compared to a car crash. So where better to go than a car race on ice? Yes, you heard that right, to assess President Trump's first 2 years in office.
The BBC's Alim Iqbal has taken on the chilly assignment from New Hampshire.
This was the state where it all really started for Donald Trump in his campaign. In a packed field of candidates, he emerged an early leader here as a presidential hopeful. There's been so much action since, and it's hard to imagine that we've only just hit the halfway point of his first term in office. Well, it has been incredibly unpredictable, chaotic even. And while some have found it an exhilarating time, it's not been without its carnage and its casualties. And of course, I'm not talking about this race. It wasn't long before this so-called winter blast event in sub-zero temperatures descended into utter bedlam. Once they'd emerged from the wreckage, what did some of the drivers here have to say about the past 2 years?
I'll be honest about it is, I'm happy. I ain't gonna lie about it. Is it perfect? No, but who is?
He doesn't beat around the bush. He's just straight up guy. And I think that's what country needs, so.
What are you shaking your head for?
I hate him. He's an awful president. That's how the last 2 years have gone. Awful, I think. He's terrible. He's not a president. He's not a leader.
And many have asked why Republicans haven't spoken out more when Donald Trump's changed their party so radically. Well, those who have voiced their concerns, like former state chairman of the party, Fergus Cullen, have often felt left out in the cold.
I've lost dozens of friendships over this.
In recent midterm elections, on the whole, candidates who supported Trump got his backing and did well, and some who didn't were made examples of.
The Republicans are not going to abandon this guy until their seat is at risk because of him. And so the lesson that they all gain from the midterms is, hey, if I'm from a solid Republican district, I don't need to worry. In fact, it's harmful to me if I oppose the guy. So the best they can hope for is that they keep their mouths shut instead of being cheerleaders for him. Others are cheerleaders for him. They find it's good for fundraising. They find it's good for their re-election prospects.
Winter blast has restarted after a huge pileup. In spite of all the turbulence, Donald Trump continues to maneuver through investigations and protests and opposition, and, crucially, keep his base happy. But how will he navigate the second half of what's already proved to be a tumultuous ride? Alim Iqbal, BBC News, in Groveton, New Hampshire.
He gets all the good gigs.
Why would anyone do that?
I know. They always send Alim.
So
the president's main battle is, of course, to secure funding for his wall. Today, a bipartisan group of lawmakers are meeting on the Hill to try and find the compromise. They've 3 weeks to do it, and neither side wants to return to a shutdown.
The Congressional Budget Office estimates it cost the US economy $11 billion. $3 billion of that will never be recovered. And yesterday, Moody's said that if the president shut down the federal government again, as he has threatened he might do, it could be even more costly. With me now is Kayleigh McEnany. She's spokesperson for the Republican National Committee. Kayleigh, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Does the president appreciate how damaging it might be to him politically if there is another government shutdown?
You know, he signaled that there are a number of options. He said that is one option on the table. Another option to secure the funding is to declare a national emergency. And the White House has indicated they're looking at even more options within his executive constitutional authority to get the wall funding. So I think he wants to avoid another government shutdown, too. We'll see where we are 3 weeks from now. It is an option on the table, however.
I imagine that you've been hearing from Republicans. You're head of the Republican National Committee. What have they been telling you about the shutdown?
You know, I think that they realize that this is worth something. That border wall funding is something worth fighting for, and that the government shutdown to this extent. A lot of Republicans wanted the shutdown to continue, and I've had to explain that the 3-week continuing resolution is a means to get to an end, showing the president is being reasonable, rational, even-handed, trying to get the border wall funding via compromise. But a shutdown at the end is still the option. But I can tell you, Republicans were very happy that this happened and that the president stood on principle.
Kayleigh, good to see you. Let's just put up President Trump's tweet on this, where he says that unless they come up with something for the wall, they are wasting their time. I just wonder, is there a grey area on border security where technology and steel fences can be called different things, can be called a wall, so that both sides can save some face?
The president's been pretty clear, unmistakably clear, that he needs a southern barrier. So he was willing to move from concrete to steel slats, but he's been very clear that Border Patrol has said there needs to be a physical barrier, and absolutely that means in concert with technology. It means in concert with increased Border Patrol, but I don't think he's willing to budge on this idea of a physical barrier.
2,000 miles of it?
It's going to be where necessary. In certain points of our border, there are natural landmarks that make it not necessary to have a physical barrier. So in those areas, we might not need it. But certainly there are insecure areas where we have seen illegal immigrants come through. And it's in those areas where we do need to see some sort of physical structure.
Kayleigh, I've got you in the studio. I want to ask you about this row between the president and his intelligence chiefs. The president today on Twitter calling his intelligence chiefs, the head of the CIA, the head of the FBI, the director of national intelligence, all people he appointed, calling them naive, passive, saying they need to go back to school. Is that really helpful?
You know, I think what the president is saying here is for the intel chiefs to downplay some of the threats the president has indicated are coming from.
And passive, Kayleigh.
Because he sees Iran as a threat, and I think the vast majority of the United States looks at Iran as a threat, and to downplay Iran's true intents of achieving and getting nuclear weapons at the end of this.
But then you can say, I disagree with that assessment, but to call them personally naive, is that the kind of language a president should be using of his own intelligence chiefs?
I think the president feels like he needs to call them out. I think he thinks it's important to call out Iran, to call out North Korea, and if necessary, in this instance, to call out the intel chiefs whose assessments he disagrees with.
Okay, Kayleigh, thanks very much for coming in.
There's quite a few of them, Catty. I was just going to say, there's quite a few of them throwing other things into the melting pot as well, though, aren't there? Besides the border wall, other things to do with immigration.
Yeah, well, that will be the big negotiation that carries on, is how much Democrats can now get on immigration in return for giving something to Mr. Trump that he can call a border wall. We'll see that over the course of the next 2.5 weeks. It's going to be a big battle. Here is my favorite story of the day. A 911 emergency operator has to be ready for anything, always available to respond to a cry for help. One of them in Lafayette, Indiana, got more than she bargained for, however, when she took a call from a young boy who was facing a really major emergency, his maths homework.
And Antonia Bundy did what any 911 operator should do. She solved his problem.
You had a bad day at school?
Yeah, I just came to tell you that.
Yeah, what happened at school that made you have a bad day?
I just have tons of homework.
Oh, okay. What subjects do you have homework in?
Math, and it's so hard.
Okay. So what are you learning in math? What's so difficult?
Fractions.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
And she went on to solve it. He was stuck on 3 quarters and a quarter, how to add them together.
So you're sitting there and you're thinking you have to take dispatches, and generally speaking what you're getting is calls from people because they've got a fire in their house or they've got robber at their front door, and this kid calls you up and says he's got a real problem. And
Yeah.
what do you think? What goes through your mind?
I tell you what the danger with that is. Everybody who now knows that there's a woman in Lafayette who answers problems for maths, they're all going to be calling. My daughter is currently looking for a number for Indiana Lafayette, I tell you.
to see if they can help with you, to see if you can help with.
Yeah.
But good for her. I love the fact that she actually
Well
had the grace and the kindness of spirit not to say, "I'm far too busy to take your call, young man. You have to find somebody else to help you."
He was very
which I think
polite
might
at the
be
end.
my reaction.
He kind of said, "Sorry to trouble you, but thanks anyway." Put the phone down.
Yeah, what was going through his mind? I'm wondering if I've taught my kids all wrong. You know, this is the number they need to call.
Maybe.
There
This
we
is
go.
Beyond 100 Days from the BBC.
And coming up for viewers on the BBC News Channel and BBC World News, what's causing the extreme cold weather in parts of the United States? We'll be hearing from a meteorologist.
And the latest on those protests in Venezuela as rival leaders struggle to gain control of the country. We'll be going live to Venezuela. That is all still to come.